He had won 37 fights and lost every piece of himself in the process. But when they forced him in again, he didn't attack. He just lay down and closed his eyes. The air inside the abandoned warehouse stank of blood, sweat, and iron. Flickering lights hung from rusted chains, barely illuminating the metal cage in the center. Men shouted over one another, placing bets, waving bills, some already drunk, others hungry for violence. In the middle of it all, a pit bull stood trembling, his legs raw, his breath uneven. He had no name, at least not one that meant anything. His handler called him Champ, only when he won. The rest of the time, he was just a tool, a thing, a money machine with teeth. His ribs jutted out beneath skin caked in dried mud and blood. One ear was torn nearly in half. Scars laced his chest and legs like a map of every battle he'd been forced into. He had won 37 fights, more than any dog in the underground circuit around the county. And he had never been petted, never played fetch, never slept on anything softer than concrete. The crowd roared as a new opponent was shoved into the ring, a younger pit bull, lean and wild-eyed, snarling at the chain-link walls as if trying to tear them apart. The handler barked orders. Another man shoved Champ toward the center with a metal rod. But something had changed. He didn't lunge. He didn't growl. He just lowered himself slowly, like a worn machine winding down for the last time, then lay flat on the cold ground, closed his eyes, and waited. There was no bark, no fight, just silence. The crowd began to boo. "Get him up! Lazy mutt!" A heavy boot slammed into his side. He didn't move. Then from the back of the warehouse, behind the crowd, behind the smoke and the noise, someone new appeared. A woman, no older than 30, wearing a navy hoodie and jeans, stood motionless in the shadows. Her eyes locked on the motionless dog in the ring, and she didn't look away. They named him Bruiser when he was barely 6 months old. Not because he was strong, but because even then, he didn't flinch when they hit him. He was born behind a trailer park, the runt of an accidental litter. His siblings were sold off in back alley deals for a few $100. But Bruiser, he was different, quiet, watchful. The man who took him in saw it as obedience. What he didn't know was that it was just fear. From the beginning, pain was all he knew. They tied raw meat to a rope and made him fight for scraps. They let older dogs bite him just to toughen him up. And when he whimpered, they laughed. "Gotta make him mean," they said. "Money don't come from soft dogs." By the time he was a year old, Bruiser had already tasted blood dozens of times. His teeth were filed, his ears clipped with kitchen scissors. He'd never heard kind words, only commands, screams, the slap of belts and chains against concrete. He didn't want to fight, but every time he didn't, they starved him. He learned quickly, fight or die. The fights were brutal, illegal, held in basements, junkyards, barns with padlocks and pit stains. Men with beards and beer bellies watched with dead eyes as dogs tore into each other. There were no winners, only survivors. Bruiser survived 37 times, and with each fight, something inside him died. His tail no longer wagged. His eyes turned from amber to ash. He stopped growling, not out of defiance, but because even rage had left him. All that was left was a machine running on bruises. And then came the 38th. That night he hadn't eaten in 2 days. His water bowl was filled with mud. He limped getting into the van, blood still seeping from the stitches on his chest. No one cared. The man who owned him was behind on rent again. He needed Bruiser to win, but Bruiser didn't move. He lay down and closed his eyes and waited for it to be over. But it wasn't fists that came for him this time. It was a voice, software uneven, almost afraid to speak. "Hey," the woman whispered, crouching beside the cage. Her name was Rachel. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had followed a trail of rumors, the kind passed between rescue workers in hushed tones. She'd worked at a shelter for years, but had never seen a fighting ring, only the aftermath. Torn skin, mangled paws, empty stares. Tonight she saw the source. She came looking for a dog, but what she found was something else. A soul, broken, bleeding, but still breathing. When she stepped close, someone yelled, "Back off, lady! He'll bite!" But he didn't. He didn't even raise his head. Rachel knelt outside the cage. Her hand trembled as she reached through the bars. "You don't have to fight anymore," she said. And for the first time in his life, Bruiser leaned in, not for blood, but for warmth. She returned the next day with animal control. The warehouse was empty, dogs gone, people vanished. But they'd left Bruiser behind, like a failed investment no longer worth hiding. His mouth was split, one eye swollen shut, his back leg was dislocated. The vet said he might not survive surgery, but Rachel didn't care. She named him Chance, because she believed in giving one. The first few nights were hard. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, flinched at every sound, tried to chew through his leash, then just stopped trying altogether. He paced in circles, barked in his sleep. Sometimes he'd sit in the corner and stare at the wall for hours. Rachel never raised her voice. She read near him, ate near him, slept on the couch beside his bed. Slowly he began to notice that hands could be soft, that blankets were warm, that voices didn't always come with pain. 3 weeks later, he wagged his tail. Just once. Rachel cried for an hour, but the real breakthrough came one morning when she opened the back door, expecting him to stand still like always. Instead, he stepped outside and raised his face to the sun. He didn't flinch, didn't hide. He just stood there, soaking in a world he never knew existed. He still had nightmares. Sometimes when a door slammed too hard, he would drop to the floor trembling. But now when he trembled, there was a hand to hold him. And for the first time in his life, Chance let himself fall asleep without fear. Rachel documented everything: the vet visits, the surgeries, the training sessions. She shared his story online, not for praise, but for proof that even the most broken can heal. And soon, others listened. Donations poured in. So did volunteers. But more importantly, so did dogs, rescued from rings, from chains, from silence. And Chance, he was no longer alone. There was food now, real food. Bowls filled not just with nutrition, but with care. Cooked chicken, warm rice, soft kibble soaked in broth. Not tossed at his feet, but placed gently in front of him, like a quiet invitation instead of a command. Rachel never rushed him. She sat nearby, sometimes pretending to eat too, just to show him there was nothing to fear. Over time, he stopped trembling before every bite. He started chewing instead of gulping. And sometimes, on days when the sun broke through the clouds just right, he even licked the bowl clean and waited for more. He began exploring the house slowly. First, just the corner of the living room where his bed was, then the kitchen, then the hallway. Each new space was a world he'd never dared imagine. The floor was warm. The windows brought in smells of trees and wind and life. When Rachel left for work, she'd say, "Be good, Chance." And he would watch the door for a while, ears slightly perked, then return to his spot with a soft sigh, as if to say, "Okay, I'll wait." The backyard became his first taste of freedom. Rachel let him out with a long leash at first, afraid he might bolt or panic. But he didn't. He walked in small circles, nose to the ground, learning every inch. One day he sat under the maple tree and just stared up at the sky for 20 minutes. Rachel watched from the porch, her coffee growing cold in her hands, knowing something sacred was happening. That he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to live. Then came the day he ran, not away, but through the yard, full speed, ears back, tongue flopping. It startled Rachel. He looked so much like a different dog, wild, strong, free, that for a moment she forgot everything he'd been through. And when he circled back to her, leaned against her legs and let out a deep, contented breath, she sank to the grass and hugged him for the first time. He didn't pull away. He let her hold him. That night he slept beside her bed, one paw dangling off the blanket like he belonged there. And maybe finally he did. He still carried scars. He always would. But Rachel never hid them. When people met Chance, they often asked, "What happened to him?" And she would kneel beside him, scratch behind his ear and say, "He was taught to fight, but he chose not to." Because that, she believed, was the braver story. Chance started walking on a leash around the neighborhood. At first, neighbors avoided him. Pit bull, scars, the usual looks. But Rachel didn't let it harden her. She brought treats, let kids toss them gently toward him, spoke softly, explaining his story without judgment or drama. Slowly, people stopped crossing the street. Some even asked if they could pet him. He always looked to Rachel first, and if she nodded, he stepped forward, not with aggression, but curiosity. One little boy, maybe 6 years old, sat on the curb outside his house and asked, "Was he a bad dog?" Rachel smiled and said, "No. He was a hurt dog, but he's healing." The boy nodded and reached out. Chance sniffed his hand, then licked it. The boy giggled. "He doesn't seem scary at all." "That's because he's not," Rachel said, voice tight with emotion. "He just never had someone to help him feel safe. Until now." Chance began doing more than healing. He started helping. Rachel signed him up for a therapy dog training course. Not for certification. He wasn't a perfect fit, but for exposure, for trust, for purpose. He learned patience, tolerance, how to sit quietly while a shaky hand reached for his back. And he was good at it. Gentle, still, steady. The instructor pulled Rachel aside after a session and said, "He watches people like he's waiting for them to break. And when they don't, he relaxes." Rachel just nodded, too moved to speak, because that was exactly it. He had learned to expect pain, but now he was learning to expect peace. And just as he had once stood alone in a ring of blood and fists, now he stood beside hospital beds, letting children rest their heads against his chest. He didn't need to fight anymore. He was protecting now, in the quietest, strongest way there is, by being kind when the world had taught him cruelty. Chance rewrote everything they thought they knew about pit bulls like him. He didn't just unlearn fear, he replaced it with choice. When strangers approached him with hesitation, he would pause, tilt his head, and offer his presence like a question. "Are you safe?" And if the answer was yes, he would lean in, tail wagging low, gaze soft and steady. He no longer needed commands, he simply understood. Rachel began taking him to community events, not for show, not for pity, but for proof. Proof that no one is too far gone to come back. Kids read books to him during literacy days at the library. Veterans stroked his fur at support group meetings. He sat in the laps of people who had lost too much and reminded them, without words, that survival didn't have to mean silence. And people listened, not to him, but to what he represented. There was something in the way he moved, deliberate, calm, always a second slower than expected, as if he knew that the people around him needed time, and he gave it to them. His body, once used for violence, had become a shelter. Even the mailman changed. At first, he avoided their porch. Pit bulls meant risk. But one day, Chance was sitting in the sun when the man approached. Rachel tensed, ready to call him inside. But Chance just looked up and wagged his tail once. The man hesitated, then crouched slowly. "You're not what I expected," he said. Chance leaned forward, placed his head against the man's chest, and exhaled. After that, the mail was always hand-delivered, sometimes with a treat. And so day by day, corner by corner, he dismantled the fear people had built around dogs like him. Not with tricks, not with perfect obedience, but with something more powerful, quiet resilience. He didn't chase balls, didn't jump into rivers. He wasn't playful in the way people expected rescue dogs to be. But he loved stillness. He loved lying under trees with his eyes half closed, letting the breeze play with the fur behind his ears. He loved watching birds without the urge to bark. He loved existing near the people who once would have flinched at the sight of him. And most of all, he loved Rachel. He followed her not out of habit but trust. If she moved to another room, he waited for a sound. If she laughed, he looked up. If she cried, he was already at her feet. He understood her silences, responded not with noise but with presence. She started writing a blog about him, the dog who refused to fight back. And it spread, not viral, not fast, but slow, like healing. People from across the country began reaching out, sharing photos, stories. "My dog came from a ring too. I never thought a pit bull could be gentle. I cried when I read about Chance." And every night before bed, Rachel would whisper, "You're helping people, bud." He didn't understand the words, but he understood the love in her voice. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Enough to rewrite the story that had been carved into his skin. Enough to quiet the echoes of cages, the sting of chains, the growl of men who never saw him as anything but a weapon. Enough to soften the jagged edges inside him that used to scream in the night. He no longer flinched at thunder, no longer cowered at the sound of boots on tile, no longer looked over his shoulder when food was placed in front of him, as if expecting it to disappear, or worse, come with pain. He had learned permanence. He had learned that when Rachel left, she always came back, that the door opening didn't mean danger, that his name, his real name, meant something. Not demand, not threat, but belonging. Chance. He started responding to it. Slowly at first, a flick of the ear, a glance, then eventually a trot across the grass, tail low and steady, chest forward, head held just a little higher than before. And with every small act of trust, he stitched himself back together. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. Some days he still shook in his sleep, still whimpered when something reminded him of the past, still backed away from loud voices or sudden gestures, or rooms with too many shadows. But now, he had a place to retreat to, a warm corner, a steady hand, a voice that said, "You're safe, I'm here." Healing didn't make him forget, it made him remember differently, because now, when his scars were noticed, they weren't hidden. Rachel would kneel beside him and say, "Yeah, he's been through hell, but he came out the other side still gentle." And that word, gentle, fit him better than any name he'd ever been called. He became the dog people pointed to when they said, "See? It's not the breed, it's what we do to them." He became proof that cruelty doesn't always win, proof that mercy can rewire something long thought lost, proof that even the most wounded hearts can find a rhythm again, slowly, carefully, stubbornly. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet new rhythm, Chance began to offer love back. Not all at once, but in pieces. A paw rested gently on a stranger's knee, a muzzle pressed into a crying child's chest, a still presence next to someone who didn't yet have the words for their pain. He didn't need to bark or beg or perform, he just needed to be there. To choose softness in a world that once demanded rage, to stand still when he used to tremble, to lay down in peace where once he had fallen in exhaustion. And in doing so, he didn't just heal, he taught others how to heal too, not by instruction, not through grand gestures, but simply by showing up, quiet and whole in the places where others still felt broken. He became a companion to people who no longer trusted their own feet, let alone the world around them. Veterans with invisible wounds, children learning to speak again, women who flinched when someone raised their hand too quickly. Chance didn't fix anyone. That wasn't his gift. He just listened, with his body, with his breath, with the deep stillness of someone who had known what it meant to hurt and survive it. At the local trauma center, he was never registered as a therapy dog, but the staff let him sit in on group sessions anyway. Some days he would curl up next to a chair, head resting on the foot of someone too afraid to speak. Other times he would stand by the door until a teenager, too ashamed to enter, took a step closer just to be near him. Rachel never interrupted. She didn't have to. He always seemed to know who needed him most. He never asked for anything. No leash, no reward, just a patch of floor and a heartbeat to lean against. There was one boy, Jonah, who hadn't spoken a word in 4 months. After witnessing his father's violence, he stopped eating in front of people. Wouldn't touch anything unless it came sealed and silent. One afternoon, Rachel brought Chance into the room. The boy didn't look up. Chance didn't move. Rachel sat beside him, opened a small container of crackers, and gently placed one near Chance's paw. Then another, and another. The boy stared. His eyes flicked to the dog's face, then back to the crackers. Chance didn't eat them. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, slowly, the boy reached forward and pushed one closer to Chance's mouth. The pit bull sniffed it, paused, then gently took it and laid his head down in the boy's lap. No bark, no noise, just contact. Jonah whispered, "You're not scary." They were the first words he'd said since the night everything fell apart. No one clapped, no one cheered, but Rachel cried into her sleeve. Moments like that didn't go viral. They weren't filmed or shared or stamped with filters, but they were real, solid, etched into the bones of the people who witnessed them. Proof that sometimes the quietest love is the loudest kind. At home, Chance remained as gentle as ever. He never barked at delivery drivers, never chased squirrels, never tore up furniture or growled at strangers. His greatest rebellion was that he never became what they wanted him to be. He never became a monster. He became a mirror instead, showing people who they were and how they treated him. Kids stopped asking if he'd ever attack someone. They started asking if they could hug him, and he let them, every single time. It had been 2 years since Rachel found him, 2 years since that warehouse, since the blood-soaked floor and the silence that tasted like surrender. And now in a home that smelled like coffee and old books, with morning light pouring in through open windows, Chance slept curled at the foot of Rachel's bed. No leash, no crate, no fear, just peace. His muzzle had started to gray around the edges, not from age, but from softness, from all the quiet mornings, the gentle evenings, the long walks with no destination. He'd learned to love the ordinary, the sound of socks on hardwood, the creak of the porch swing, the slow exhale Rachel made when she sat beside him on the couch and leaned into his warmth. They had routines now. In the mornings, she brewed coffee and he waited for toast crusts. In the afternoons, they visited the center, where he greeted old friends and newcomers with that same low tail wag and silent patience. In the evenings, they sat beneath the maple tree, the same one where he had once stood frozen, staring up at the sky as if trying to understand what freedom was. Now he understood. It wasn't about space or safety. It was about being chosen, again and again, by someone who saw past the wreckage. One spring morning, Rachel sat on the porch with a pen in her hand and Chance's head resting in her lap. She was writing a letter, not to a person, but to the system that had failed him, to the people who still believed some dogs weren't worth saving, to the voices online who said, "You can't fix them, and once they bite, they always will." Her words were calm, firm. She told them about the boy who spoke again, the veteran who stopped shaking, the little girl who used to fear dogs until one laid his head in her lap and just stayed. She told them about the way Chance had taught her how to be still, how to trust, how to begin again, without expectation, without timelines, just presence. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote, "He was never broken, just buried." That summer, Chance was nominated for a local Hero Dog Award. Rachel declined the spotlight, but accepted the plaque. It hung by the front door, not for guests, but as a quiet reminder to herself of how far they had both come. He never knew about the award, never cared. But when strangers visited and knelt to meet him eye to eye, he would do what he always did, take one small step forward and offer his trust like a gift. And if they were lucky, he'd press his head into their chest and sigh, deep and low and healing. Rachel knew the years ahead wouldn't be endless. Time, after all, is never something we're promised. But every day with Chance was a kind of miracle, not because he survived, but because he chose to love, despite it all. And when the day finally came, when he grew too tired to climb the porch steps, when the vet whispered gently, and Rachel laid beside him on the floor, her arms wrapped around the body that had once trembled at every human touch, she whispered only one thing into his ear. "You were never the fighter they wanted you to be. You were the healer we never deserved." And with his final breath, Chance exhaled not pain, but peace. Because in the end, it wasn't how many fights he had won. It was who he had become when the fighting stopped. If this story moved you, share it. For every dog still trapped in silence, for every hand that might choose kindness instead of cruelty, and for every Chance out there, still waiting to be seen. Subscribe for more true stories of quiet heroes, second chances, and the people who never stop believing.